as everyone else has said, my views do not necessarily reflect WLS or Mark's own personal views, as much as I'd like them to.
I'll let you know if they do.
I'm sure you will. So today I'm going to talk about China's North Korea policy and specifically look at how the DPRK nuclear issue impacts Chinese bureaucratic politics, Chinese policy shifts, and U.S.-China relations. So everyone, reading the New York Times coverage over the last 5 months has a pretty good general grasp of how China's policy is generally driven by a fear of collapse. This is obviously tied to North Korea's perceived value as a strategic buffer, linking back to the Korean War, a possible massive refugee influx if North Korea was to collapse, possible irredentism of the Korean minority that lives along the Chinese-North Korean border that would be linked to a nationalist, unified South Korean-led peninsula, and also lastly, the economic growth intended for northeastern provinces that are actually tied to prospects for North Korea's economic reform. However, I would personally add one more factor that drives Chinese policy, as bureaucratic politics. So what is the bureaucratic politics of China's policy? I would argue that it's a bifurcated policy management system, and that means increasingly centralized decision-making, but an increasingly diffuse implementation. This creates a number of interesting dynamics that we can look at, specifically inter-bureaucratic competition, inter-bureaucratic convergence, bureaucratic inertia, central-local conflict, and a reflection of domestic politics in China's policy. Specifically, I'd like to look at how China's decision-making body comes about and how the inter-bureaucratic competition is impacted by the nuclear issue. So China's policy is decided ultimately at the highest levels of the Chinese government, with Xi Jinping leading the Politburo Standing Committee on recommendations provided by the Foreign Affairs Leading Small Group, which is kind of China's version of the National Security Council. These are kind of impacted mostly by the primary stakeholders. This is the International Liaison Department, which is the Communist Party's own Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Chinese military, and the government's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There are secondary stakeholders, including the provinces that border North Korea, the Ministry of Commerce to promote business ties, the Ministry of Public Security to manage local security issues and crime along the border, including as well academics and even businesses that run trade with North Korea. There are also silent stakeholders that don't necessarily have a direct input into the policy process, but impact China's policy overall, most predominantly the United States, but also North Korea itself, and even Taiwan. So specifically looking at the inter-bureaucratic competition, I would argue that the PLA's policy is not only tinged by the nuclear issue, but actually heavily impacted by it. So everyone talks about China's North Korea's policy, and I would propose that we don't talk about China's unitary actor, but different bureaucracies within that. And even within those bureaucracies, there are dynamics between the PLA services. For instance, the PLA Army, when they propose to have a budget coming in from Xi Jinping and others, the most likely place they're going to find a land war in the next 20 years, arguably, is North Korea for the Korean War Take Two. So that makes sense for them to propose, continued value of North Korea as a strategic buffer and a focus on the Korean issues. However, the PLA Navy is increasingly focusing on the South China Sea and obviously maritime activity away from the Korean Peninsula. This gives them a disincentive to focus on North Korea and would be disinclined to value North Korea as a strategic buffer. The PLA Air Force, obviously in the 21st century, air power dictates that traditional land battles pitched over a strategic buffer are less valuable. So this would mean that the PLA Air Force has less incentive to value North Korea for China's own security. And most importantly, the PLA 2nd Artillery, which is the strategic nuclear forces of China, actually has an extremely bureaucratic incentive to be disinclined to support North Korea, specifically looking at the impacts of the nuclear program and missile program as an incentive for the US to propose and further the missile defense program in Northeast Asia. So the question is, are the recent developments of the third nuclear test and the impact of US increased proposition of missile defense in Northeast Asia actually changing Chinese policy? Well, I would suggest that China's policy is most responsive to nuclear issues. That while the bureaucratic politics usually create an immense and massive crippling bureaucratic inertia, the one issue that always gets the Chinese leadership active is nuclear policy. In 2003, George Bush was talking to former President Jiang Zemin and insinuated that if there was no progress on diplomatic front for North Korean denuclearization, the United States would have to contemplate a strike on North Korea. 6 months later, China started the six-party talks and brought North Korea to the table. I'd call that action. In 2006, after the first nuclear test, Hu Jintao formally, personally wrote the Chinese response and called the test blatant and flagrant, which is something usually reserved for Chinese enemies. That was the strongest word ever used against North Korea by the Chinese government. In 2009, you can argue that because of the failed progress from 2006, and the second test led the Chinese government to reverse policy and support North Korea. So the question is, will this third test in 2013 again change Chinese government policy toward a more US line supporting denuclearization? US former and current government officials believe that they are seeing this change. Christopher Hill, former head of US delegation of six-party talks, John Huntsman was a former US ambassador to China, Kurt Campbell, and even President Obama are seeing these changes. So the question is, what are they seeing? Well, most recently, there's evidence that there's a possible significant shift in China's policy. One of the top Chinese scholars said that the Xi Jinping administration reportedly prioritizes denuclearization over peace and stability. If this is true, this is a dramatic change in China's policy from the three no's. In order, used to be no war, no instability, and no nukes, but in that order. Now they're apparently prioritizing denuclearization over peace and stability. So the question is, what drove this shift? And what indicators are there that this is actually happening? I would suggest there are three possible drivers of this policy shift. One, most pessimistically, is simply bargaining leverage in the US-China relationship. So theoretically, this would be China's acknowledgement that its relationship with the US isn't going very well. You can look at cyber issues or others, and they would be able to leverage North Korea cooperation as saying, okay, let's not focus on the cyber issue, let's focus on North Korea. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that China's perceived threat perception of North Korea has actually changed and led to the third nuclear test and the missile test in December 2012. I would suggest this is unlikely, but possible. I would believe the most likely actual driver of this policy shift is number three, which would be a revised cost-benefit analysis for support of North Korea, specifically linked to not actually the North Korean test, but the Western response, and what that legitimizes in Northeast Asia for Chinese security. Japanese rearmament, in possible nuclear proliferation to South Korea, Japan, or even Taiwan, and most importantly, US missile defense. So the question is, if this shift is actually happening, where will we see it? I would suggest that the most obvious way is Chinese leverage. And the Chinese government likes to tell us that they're not great friends with North Korea, but then at the same time, they'll tell us that they're doing more than we can expect. At the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2011, hosted by IISS, Chinese Defense Minister Liang Guanglie said that China was doing more than you can imagine to solve the North Korea issue. In 2013, when the US Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Dempsey, visited Beijing, his host told him that they were working on it. So apparently the Chinese government likes to think they have some amount of leverage over North Korea. And the reality is, yes, they do. I'm convinced that if Xi Jinping woke up tomorrow morning and decided he had enough of North Korea, they could do something about it. But the reality is that China's convinced itself that North Korea is still valuable to China. And in that sense, there's a limited willingness for China to actually move on North Korea. So what have they done in the past, and what might that mean? Most notably, there's the oil cutoffs. China provides 90% of North Korea's foreign oil, and they apparently cut off oil in 2003, 2006, 2009, 2010, and even this year in response to the missile and nuclear tests. So the question is, did this actually happen? No one knows. It's never been an official Chinese government policy. The most credible evidence was from 2003, but that was based on an economist report sourced by 2 Chinese sources. That's it. There's nothing very credible about the cutoffs. The nuclear tests in 2006, 2009, and 2013 took place despite the harshest Chinese protests, and in 2013, the test was actually despite a November 2012 Chinese Politburo delegation explicitly telling Kim Jong-un to not test. However, there has been successful Chinese leverage in the past, like I mentioned, the six-party talks, and possibly the recent visit by the top North Korean leader, Cho Ryong-hae, last month, that elicited North Korean offers of a willingness to return to the talks. However, most notably, when Cho returned to Pyongyang, Ro Dong-song-bo was actually conspicuously silent on this very important issue and did not say that he was willing to return to the talks, even though it was covered in the Chinese media. So what's the second indicator that might suggest a change Chinese policy. I would suggest that it's sanctions enforcement. The legislators of sanctions against North Korea, mainly the US and South Korea, can't actually enforce many sanctions because they just don't interact with North Korea that much. Mainly the enforcer is China. Historically, China has opposed sanctions and had limited effect on sanctions due to foreign policy principles of non-intervention, its own fear of collapse, which we've covered, and the bureaucratic politics of actual sanctions implementation. The past enforcement has been somewhere along the lines of bureaucratic incompetence, willful ignorance, or even with the TEL, the Transport Director and Launcher, that was displayed last April in the parade of North Korea's new apparent ICBM capability. I would suggest even intentional covert assistance by some parts of the Chinese government. So the question is, what can China do to show that there's a change in policy? They could, for one, submit an actual list of luxury items that are banned. It's required by UN sanctions, but China has yet to submit it. Number two is they can have a token arrest of someone smuggling goods to North Korea or North Koreans smuggling goods to other countries. As we mentioned, there's some cooperation apparently with Iran. That's something to crack down on. The Chinese government could search North Korean ships that come through ports with credible intelligence, and possibly another dramatic show would be to deny Chinese airspace to suspicious North Korean flights to Iran. Historically, the North Korean government has been known to traffic WMD capabilities through the Beijing airport. This is one thing China could control. China has, over the last 5 months, and specifically in March, sanctioned North Korean banks. They were not actually required to do this. It was a US unilateral sanction, but the Bank of China chose to enforce the sanctions against the foreign trade bank. This is dramatic, although possibly not directed action, and this suggests that there is a change occurring. So the question is, what does this mean going forward? I would suggest that China's overall policy may be changing due to a change in the cost-benefit analysis. However, China's limited practical influence may mean a limited impact on North Korea's nuclear development. North Korea, as we've seen, is determined to have a nuclear weapons capability, and China's fear of collapse may inhibit it from expressing enough influence to limit that capability. China's policy change will be credible if there's continued evidence past this weekend's Xi Jinping-Barack Obama summit in California throughout the rest of the year. This will suggest that it's not simply bargaining leverage in the US-China relationship, and there's a tangible shift in policy. And if there is a shift in policy, what does this mean for the US-China relationship? This means that there is an opportunity for cooperation on something that is very important to the US and actually important for Chinese security, and could possibly be one of those things that Barack Obama and Xi Jinping are looking for to build mutual trust and not focus on the downside of the relationship. One suggestion that China is willing to cooperate with the US is increased evidence from Chinese scholars that the Chinese government is finally realizing that there's a need to discuss contingency planning of North Korea with the United States, which is previously a taboo topic, but now apparently they're willing to discuss it. So I would submit that even from a month ago, there is significant, if not official, evidence that China is doing a policy shift, and this is worth watching in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathan. That was even better than the preview I heard yesterday.